Wonderful story of love. Tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love. With the immortal strain, angels with rapture announce it. Shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. 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 Though you are far away, wonderful story of love. Still he doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain, e'en from the dawn of creation. Wonderful story of love. 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 Jesus provides a rest. Wonderful story of love. For all the pure and blessed, rest in those mansions above us, with those who've gone on before us, singing the rapturous chorus. Wonderful story of love. 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 I am weak, but thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Through this world of toil and snares, if I falter, Lord, who cares? Who with me my burden shares? None but thee, dear Lord, none but thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to thee.
All right. So looking at, we talked about verses 29 and 30. So let's look at 31 through 34. And then we'll move on, or actually back up and do the overview of all of this. The houses of the villages, however, so there's a distinction being made between villages and the walled cities. The easiest way to describe this is a fortified city, a walled city, would be Jerusalem and other major places like that. Even before they went into the land, cities like Jericho were fortified cities of the people that dwelled in the land before them. That's what it's talking about when it talks about the houses inside of walled cities. This is talking about towns, less organized, less fortified, not urban centers, but more countryside dwelling places, um, which have no surrounding wall, shall be considered as open fields. And so he's just saying, once you get outside of the walled city, these other towns and villages, these small towns and villages, I'm going to treat them the same way that we treat the land in general. Now, there's obvious reasons for that, and I've touched on it a little bit, but I want to go ahead and touch on it one more time quickly. What's the difference between your and think about, and again, Jericho was not an Israelite city, but think about Rahab. Where was Rahab's house? Yeah, on the wall of the city. So this wasn't land. This was a dwelling place. Um, the cities were all built on top of each other like that, and that was housing. You didn't get your living off your housing. You didn't grow crops or raise cattle or raise sheep or goats on property surrounding your house inside of a walled city. But these places are directly connected to the farmlands, and these might be built on the family property. That so he's just saying these are going to be classified the same way as the open fields. They have redemption rights and revert in the Jubilee. So everything that we studied about pertaining to the land, the open field land that they had for their crops and their livestock, applies to houses in the villages. As for the cities of the Levites, now, does anybody recall off the top of their head um, the cities of the Levites and how that structure was, what that structure was all about, and how it was done? I think there were 10 of them. I might have the number wrong. I didn't look it up, so I'm working off a really old memory. I think there were 10 of them. They were scattered all throughout the land. Uh, did the Levites, the descendants of Levi, did they get an inheritance? Not a land, not a territory like the other tribes. How did we get 12 tribes then? Yeah, Joseph's two sons each got a tribe, or a parcel of land. And so they didn't get that. They got cities scattered throughout all of these territories and farmland associated with those cities. And so this is what he saw. As for the cities of the Levites have a permanent right of redemption for the houses of their cities, which are their possession. They were given cities. And he just says they always get to redeem their houses. They don't have that 1 year limit on them like the other houses. What therefore belongs to the Levites may be redeemed, and a house sale in the city of this possession reverts in the Jubilee, for the houses of the Levites are their possession among the sons of Israel. But pasture fields of their cities shall not be sold, for that is their perpetual possession. So here's the distinction among the Levites. They weren't allowed to sell their land the way that other people were. That was to be their permanent possession. All right. So let's talk about all of this as a block. Going back to everything that we studied last week and the things that we've studied up to this point tonight. Why did God make these land laws? All right, I think I said it this way at some point in the class last week, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. I don't remember my exact words, but I think it was pretty close to God was not sitting up there thinking up new rules that he thought would be good ideas. Okay, these laws were given for a reason. So why is that? And almost everything that God does when it comes to giving instructions to man, um, disciplining man, that's what instruction is. If you study science or mathematics or music, you study various disciplines. Um, all of these things had instructional purposes. They were teaching us about things. I've made the argument before, both in classes, and I have a whole sermon dedicated to it that I'm pretty sure I've preached here sometime in the last 20 years. Uh, Even marriage was given to teach us something. So everything, every rule that God gives has something behind it that it's trying to get us to learn. When Americans read Leviticus 25, that's us. We naturally evaluate the laws that are expressed here through the lens of private property rights. Why do we do that? That's the world we live in. And it's a value that is quite sacrosanct in this country. In fact, we're going to hear a lot more about it because there is a growing movement, particularly among young folks, for certain degrees of socialism or communism to be brought into our government structure. And those things do not ascribe to our private property right mindset. And so there's going to be a lot of talk about this kind of stuff. That is the way we look at the world. We assume that if somebody buys a piece of land, if they make improvements to it, they work it well, that they should get the benefits of that property, and they should get the benefits of that property perpetually. Um, it's their investment. It's their work product. It's theirs. That is not how God asked Israel to think about these things. The question that he never asked is, who deserves this land? Never once is that part of the discussion. The question was always, whose land is it? Which is a very different question. And he answers that question extremely plainly in this chapter. In verse 23, the land is mine. He wanted the Israelite to view even their inherited land as ultimately belonging not to them, but to God. Everything else flows from that statement, the land is mine. You will do this because the land is mine. This will happen because the land is mine. A rough, and this is a very rough modern comparison, and it's not even modern, it's historical. But in England under the monarchy, historically, all land was ultimately held under the authority of the crown, belonged to the crown, did not belong to the king, belonged to the crown, which is a different thing. Um, Kings die and are replaced. The crown continues. And so that is the way that all land was viewed rather than absolute private ownership. The king remained the ultimate legal authority over the land. He could alter rights of possession at his own. There's a lord living in a manor, got 100,000 acres to manage. The king can wake up one day and say, you know what? I don't like Wesley there anymore. I'm going to put John there. And you just get moved out of your house and somebody else gets moved in. He's the ultimate legal authority over the land and can alter the rights of possession. And generally, when it was done properly, that was only done when the interests of the kingdom required it. Not to do something nice to somebody I like or to get back at somebody that I don't, but because it was in the best interests of the kingdom. Americans actually have a faint echo of that, which is our practice of eminent domain. Private property rights can yield to, we're going to call it a higher government authority, because again, built into our system is private ownership and rights to private ownership that cannot be taken. But when there is a public benefit, and by the way, used to that was very, very narrowly distinguished by the courts. Here in later years, it's become much more broadly defined. But when there is a public benefit, your rights of private ownership can be superseded. What's the kicker in America, though, that just shows how much we invest in the idea of private ownership? The government doesn't just take your land. The government is obligated to give just compensation for it. If your land gets taken, they at least have to pay you for it. Supposedly pay you what it's worth. So the comparison is not exact, but it helps understand a little bit about what's going on here. When God says the land is mine, even though he says, I'm giving you the land and it's your land and you're going to take possession of the land, that does not supersede the fact that it belongs ultimately to him. And therefore, he's the one that gets to dictate how it's used, who possesses it, and all those kinds of questions. So the Lord's the true owner. Every family held, and this is an important language, held its inheritance under his authority. They inherited the land. What does that mean? What is unique about an inheritance? You don't earn it. You don't work for it. It's given to you. It's bequeathed to you. You inherit it. And that is exactly the picture that the Bible gives us. Even though they went in and fought wars, who gave them victories in those battles? God. And in fact, in several battles, we have records where they clearly should have lost, but they won. Either under ridiculous circumstances, completely and terribly outnumbered, they win anyway, not because of the prowess of their fighting, but because the opposing army gets confused and starts killing itself and running away and all sorts of things happening. That's not their prowess on the battlefield. That's God. Jericho is the prime example. The very first piece of property they take over. They go in. Well, I don't guess it's the very first. They took some of the kings of Ai on the way in, but the very first city that they conquer, they go in, and how do they take Jericho? They march around it and blow on some trumpets. Who wins a war like that? Who fights a war like that? Yeah, God. The walls didn't come tumbling down because the trumpets were so loud, despite what anybody thinks. Trumpets are loud. But that's not why the walls came down. Walls came down because God brought them down. Why did God bring them down? Because he wanted them to have the land. It was his land. He wanted them to have it, and he was giving it to them. And God, in these laws, in this whole structure of redemption and of Jubilee return back to the rightful possessor, God is protecting his gift. The promised land was not something Israel earned. We got to remember, before Israel ever entered into Canaan, God told them. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 9, verses 4 through 7. This is what it says. Do not say in your heart, after the Lord your God has thrust them out before you. Notice he reminds them who did the work. Do not say in your heart, after the Lord your God has thrust them out before you, it is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to possess this land, whereas it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out before you. Not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart are you going in to possess the land, but because of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God is driving them out from before you, and that he might confirm the word that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Know therefore that the Lord your God is not giving you this land to possess it because of your righteousness, for you are a stubborn people. And so he goes through all this hassle to say basically two things. Don't think that I'm driving these people out because you deserve it. I'm driving them out for two reasons. One, because they are wicked. And so I'm taking it from them. And two, because I keep my promises. And I made a promise to Abraham a long time ago to look, and all this land would belong to his descendants. And I repeated that promise to Jacob, to Isaac, and then to Jacob. And now you, the descendants of Jacob, are going to receive the benefit of that promise. In other words, I'm giving it to you not because you are righteous, but because I am. And then, for good measure, just in case they didn't catch on to the 4 times in these 3 verses that he said, it is not because of your righteousness, he says, you're a stubborn people, which is the same thing as saying what? How do you get the label stubborn? Do you get the label stubborn by being submissive and following instructions and following the rules? Is that how you get called stubborn? No. How do you get called stubborn? Yeah, by determining, you know what, you can't tell me what to do. I'll do what I want to do. And I'm going to show you that I can do what I want to do. And every once in a while, parents get really, really smart and think that they can fool their kids and tell them that they don't want them to do something that they want them to do, and that their stubbornness is going to cause them to do it. Works occasionally, but I'll just warn you, it doesn't work all that often. Not really good methods, because then when it doesn't work, you can't even say anything because you told them to do it. So anyway, they were stubborn people. They were not compliant with God. They were not following all of his instructions. God gave Israel the land because of his own covenant purposes. He made a promise and he had a covenant and he was doing a work. What was that work ultimately about? What was the promise to Abraham? What was at the core of it ultimately? In your seed, all nations shall be blessed. The Messiah. At the core of the covenant was God bringing Messiah. This had to happen in order for him to keep that covenant. So it was his own covenant purposes, not because they deserved it, not because they worked for it, not because they earned it. Now, he did tell them, because there was two tribes that said what? Y'all remember the story? They get to the border. What would that be? The eastern border of Israel, the Jordan River. So there's this river, and listen, rivers have always been natural boundaries because they separate people from the other side. So they're all camped on the east side of the Jordan. And there's a couple of those tribes that raise sheep and say, what? This is really good land for us. Why do we need to bother going over there? Let us just live here. And what does God say? He says, okay, I'll let you do that, but you still have to go over and fight with your brethren. You can't let your brothers go to war while you're sitting here at home lazing around. Now, the interesting part is they weren't fighting for that land. They were fighting for this other land, but they weren't going to get that land anymore. But they still had to go. Does that mean that they're earning anything? And the answer is no. It means that they are submitting to God. And so before they enter Canaan, he instructs them not only these things, but also that the land was to be divided among the tribes according to his command. That's in Numbers chapter 26, starting about verse 52 through about verse 56. He lays out all of that. Joshua actually carries that out. Ultimately, Joshua chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, it's distributed by lot to families. And so the parameters of what goes to each tribe, very clearly described by God. I say very clearly, not very easy for us to figure it out on a map today, although some of them are a little bit easier than others, but some of the landmarks aren't terribly good landmarks for us. But how did it break down within the tribe? Well, it fell to families by lot. And so God is saying, this is how I'm going to make distribution of the land. This is what I want you to do. Joshua ultimately does that. And so God even makes the distribution of the land. To what parcel of land goes to what family? Through this process that he gave them. And he has the right to preserve that allotment. It's his land. And I'll just illustrate it like this. I own a piece of land, let's say. This is completely hypothetical because I don't own any land. But I own a piece of land and I decide that I want David to have it. What do? I take steps and measurements to be sure that it gets to his hands. I have the right to preserve that and to make sure that he's the one that inherits the property. And what God does is take it a step further and says, look, I want him to have the land and use the land, and his descendants to have the land and use the land, so that I'm going to carry this down to this level. I'm putting some qualifications on his use of the land that says this: he can't give it to somebody else forever. He can sell it to somebody else for a while, but it's going to go back to his family whether he likes it or not. And it wouldn't be a matter of liking it or not. It'd be a matter of God preserving that inheritance. That's an important idea. So keep that in mind. An Israelite could temporarily lose the use of his inheritance because of some hardship, but God did not intend for his original gift to disappear forever simply because of a family misstep or misfortune. Okay, so David's a good steward of the land and he takes care of it, but but who are we going to let take it? Who's technically the older of Liam and Luke? I think it's Liam too, but I'm not sure. It was a long time ago. We're going to go with Liam. Okay, my daughter says it's Luke, so we're going to go with Ariel. Luke. So Luke inherits it from his father because he's the oldest child, and Luke. I didn't really want to make it Luke, but we're going to make it Luke. Was just not a very good steward. Made some terrible decisions with the family business, and gets in all kind of financial trouble and has to sell the land. God says, you know what? Because of that individual's misstep, I am not going to allow this family to lose this property. I want this family to have this property. I'm going to make sure they keep this property. Because of that individual's misstep, I will let them suffer the loss of it. But there's a point when it goes back, so that the family goes back to their own land and has the inheritance that I gave them. The year of Jubilee restored the family's inheritance as God had originally assigned it. That's what that was all about. These laws also limit human power to some extent. Without these laws, what would happen there is the same thing that happens everywhere else in the world, which is what? Rich people buy up all the good land, take possession of the good land, hold on to possession of the good land, eventually own all of the good land, and then poor people are poor and rich people are rich, and it's hard to move from place to place. One of the ways that the United States overcame that problem was the federal government took large parcels of land and then gave it to people as they saw fit through the Homestead Act and other things like that. And they put qualifications and stipulations on it. They were at liberty to do that, to say you have to be able to prove that you can. Actually, with some of those homestead things, you would have to be able to prove over a period of a certain time period that you could actually work the land and be productive and profitable, and then it would pass to you and you'd eventually get the deed. Uh, but they were essentially doing the exact same thing that God did here, with one caveat. It wasn't in perpetuity to that family. And so what has happened is wealthy people own large chunks of property. Non-wealthy people have less and less property, and eventually you get to some of the problems that we see along those lines. What that does is it puts a lot of power and influence in a small number of people's hands. These laws also interrupted that. It helped prevent the Israelites from putting all of their confidence in wealth and power. And instead, their confidence rested in God. Because even if they lost control of their property, eventually God brought them back to it. By the way, that even happened on a national scale a few times, right? God allowed them to be carried off into captivity, taken off the land, gone somewhere else. But then he took a remnant and did what with them? Brought them back and gave them the land again. And so it happens on that level as well. God remains the one who is determining Israel's inheritance. So that's why the buyer was never truly buying land, because it belonged to God. Um, a lot of modern people struggle with this. They imagine somebody paying full price for a farm and then losing it. I bought your farm, and then somebody comes and redeems it, and I lose it. That is not what happened. Everybody knew from the beginning that the land would return at Jubilee. The purchase price reflected that reality. The buyer paid only for the number of harvests remaining before Jubilee. He was never cheated. He received exactly what he purchased. Even if it was redeemed, he was paid for the harvest that he paid for that he didn't get. The question then comes up, what about improvements? And this is probably the most common modern objection. Suppose somebody purchased the right to farm a piece of neglected field. By the way, that happened. I got in financial trouble. I didn't have money for seed. I didn't have money to spend maintaining. So I would let land go into a state of neglect because I didn't have the resources to manage it. So somebody gets it, cleans out all the rocks, digs irrigation ditches, builds terraces, improves the soil, does all this work, plants it, and the Jubilee shows up and he loses everything he's invested. From our perspective, that seems unfair for a lot of reasons, but fundamentally because we think that that kind of hard work and improvement affords me some type of ownership in the land. Leviticus doesn't argue that point. Instead, it just assumes something very much more fundamental than that no amount of improvement to the land changes who owns the land. You can do whatever you want to it. The land still belongs to God. You can build a tower that rises up into the heavens, and the land is still the Lord's. And if he doesn't want you there, he can disperse you throughout the earth, which he did way back at Babel, right? The buyer certainly benefited from the improvements that he made while he possessed the land, but he knew from the day he acquired it exactly when his right to the land would end. So he voluntarily invested in property he knew belonged ultimately to God and would eventually return to the family that God had appointed for it to belong to. That doesn't match our economic thinking and our justice thinking, but it's perfectly consistent with God's stated purpose for the promised land. And I'm going to stop there. We got a couple of more things to kind of tie all this up, and then we'll move on in verse 35 and going forward from there after that. I hope this has answered some of the questions that people had, and maybe what we finish up next time will do even more. I appreciate everybody's presence and participation tonight.
Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love.